Everyone has heard of the pyramids of Egypt. Almost no one has heard that the country next door, Sudan, has more pyramids than Egypt does. Over 200 of them, built by an African empire so powerful it once conquered Egypt outright and ruled it as its own for nearly a century. This empire grew rich enough that Roman writers described its markets in disbelief. It fielded an army that marched north and sacked Roman towns in Egypt, and when Rome sent a force to punish it, its queen fought them to a standstill, took the emperor's own name in vain, and had the bronze head of his statue buried under a temple staircase, so that for centuries afterward, every priest who climbed those steps walked over the face of Caesar Augustus. This is the Kingdom of Kush. It lasted longer than the Roman Empire. It left behind a writing system we still can't fully read, and outside of specialist historians, almost nobody has heard of it. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what Kush was, but why an empire this significant got written out of the story so completely. Long before the name Kush appears in any record, the stretch of the Nile south of Egypt, the region called Nubia, had already built one of Africa's earliest complex societies. Around 2400 BC, a kingdom centered on the city of Kerma rose along the river, controlling a strategic bottleneck of trade between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world. Gold from the desert, ivory and ebony from further south, exotic animals, and enslaved people, all funneled north through Nubian hands before ever reaching Egypt. Kerma built massive mud brick structures and a sophisticated, wealthy urban culture that rivaled Egypt itself for a time. Wealthy enough that Egypt considered it a genuine strategic threat, not a peripheral neighbor. For centuries, these two civilizations, Egyptian and Nubian, would circle each other as rivals, trading partners, and eventually conquerors and conquered, in a relationship far more tangled than the simple story of Egypt and its southern neighbor usually told in textbook. Around 1500 BC, Egypt's new kingdom pharaohs turned that rivalry decisively in their own favor. Egyptian armies pushed south, conquered Kerma, and folded Nubia into the Egyptian state for roughly 500 years, governed by an Egyptian official with the title Viceroy of Kush. Its gold mines feeding Egyptian treasuries, its temples built in Egyptian style, its elite educated in Egyptian religion and writing. It's tempting to read this as simple erasure. It wasn't. Nubian elites absorbed Egyptian culture, its gods, its hieroglyphs, its royal ideology, so thoroughly that by the time Egyptian central authority finally collapsed around 1070 BC, the people left governing Nubia weren't strangers to Egyptian civilization. They were arguably some of its most devoted inheritors. When Egypt's own new kingdom fractured into competing regional powers, the Nubian elite didn't need to learn a new political language. They already spoke Egypt's. Out of that power vacuum, a new independent Nubian state emerged around the 8th century BC, centered on the city of Napata, near the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, a state history remembers as the Kingdom of Kush. And its kings didn't just reclaim independence. They looked north, at an Egypt fractured into squabbling regional dynasties, and decided they were the ones who could restore what Egypt itself had let fall apart. King Kashta pushed north into Upper Egypt around the mid-8th century BC, and his son Piye, sometimes rendered Pianki, finished the job around 728 to 716 BC, marching his army the length of the Nile and forcing every competing Egyptian ruler to submit. Piye's own victory inscription reads, less like a conqueror bragging and more like a pious restorer horrified by what he found. Egyptian princes who, in his account, didn't even know the correct rituals to honor the gods properly anymore. He wasn't invading a foreign land. In his own telling, he was rescuing Egyptian civilization from Egyptians who had let it decay. Piye and his successors, Shabaka, Shabitku, Taharka, and Tanwetamani, ruled as the legitimate pharaohs of Egypt for close to a century, recognized by history as Egypt's 25th dynasty. Modern historians often call them the Black Pharaohs. They didn't rule as foreign occupiers dressing up in borrowed royal costume. They restored temples that Egyptian dynasties had neglected, revived religious practices that had lapsed, and, for a while, ran the most powerful state in the ancient Near East from a Nubian throne. Taharqa, the most famous of the Kushite pharaohs, is even named directly in the Hebrew Bible, in the second book of Kings, as Tirhakah, king of Kush, marching to challenge the Assyrian Empire during its siege of Jerusalem. That's not a minor archaeological footnote. It means a Kushite king's actions were significant enough to be remembered in Near Eastern political memory for centuries afterward, recorded by scribes who had nothing to do with Nubia or Egypt themselves. Under the 25th dynasty, building projects flourished up and down the Nile. Temple additions at Karnak, restoration work across Egypt, and monumental construction back home at Napata and the sacred site of Jebel Barkal, believed to be a dwelling place of the god Amun himself. For a brief, remarkable century, the political and religious center of gravity for the entire Nile Valley sat not in Thebes or Memphis, but with kings who had grown up worshipping at a mountain deep in what is now Sudan. That century ended the way most ancient imperial peaks end, against an enemy with better technology and worse patience. The Assyrian Empire, expanding aggressively westward, saw Kushite-controlled Egypt as both a rival and a prize. Between roughly 674 and 663 BC, Assyrian armies, equipped with iron weapons that outmatched Kushite bronze, invaded Egypt repeatedly, culminating in the sack of Thebes itself in 663 BC, one of the most devastating blows any Egyptian or Kushite ruler had suffered in centuries. The Kushite pharaohs were pushed back out of Egypt entirely, retreating south to their original power base around Napata. It's a pattern worth noticing early because it repeats throughout Kushite history. This was a civilization that, again and again, absorbed a catastrophic military defeat, retreated deeper into its own African heartland rather than being annihilated, and rebuilt on its own terms. Losing Egypt did not mean losing Kush. For roughly a century after the Assyrian expulsion, Kush persisted as an independent kingdom based at Napata, no longer ruling Egypt, but still a serious regional power. That stability shattered around 593 BC when an Egyptian army under Pharaoh Psamtik II marched south and sacked Napata itself, a direct, humiliating strike at the Kushite heartland. Rather than attempt to hold a capital that had just proven vulnerable to Egyptian reprisal, Kush's rulers made a decision that would define the next 700 years of their civilization. They moved the capital much further south, to the city of Meroë, safely distant from Egyptian reach, in a region with better rainfall and richer agricultural land than Napata had ever offered. It was, in effect, a strategic retreat that turned into the making of an entirely new golden age. Meroë didn't just offer safety. It sat on some of the richest iron ore deposits in the ancient Nile Valley, and the Kushites exploited that resource on an industrial scale. Archaeologists have found enormous slag heaps around the ancient city, the leftover waste from iron smelting, so extensive that early 20th century excavators nicknamed Meroë the Birmingham of Africa, after England's iron-forging industrial heartland. This wasn't a minor local craft. Meroitic smiths produced tools, weapons, and agricultural implements that were traded across a huge stretch of northeastern Africa, giving Kush a technological and economic edge most of its neighbors simply couldn't match. Combine that industrial iron production with fertile farmland capable of growing cotton, sorghum, and millet, crops Napata's drier climate had never supported at the same scale. And Meroë wasn't just a safer capital than Napata. It was a genuinely more prosperous one. By the time Rome had absorbed Egypt as a province following Cleopatra's death in 30 BC, Kush sat on something Rome desperately wanted: control over the trade routes carrying gold, ivory, ebony, exotic animals, and enslaved labor north from deep inside Africa. Meroë functioned as the gatekeeper between the Mediterranean economy and everything south of it, a position that for centuries had made Nubian kingdoms wealthy long before Kush itself existed, and now made Kush arguably one of the richest states bordering the Roman world. Ancient writers, including the Greek geographer Strabo, describe Meroitic embassies and material culture with a mixture of fascination and condescension typical of Greco-Roman accounts of Africa. But the underlying picture is consistent. This was not some marginal, impoverished frontier kingdom. It was a sophisticated state controlling immense natural wealth, sitting confidently on Rome's southern border, answering to no one. One further detail set Kush apart from nearly every other ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern power, Rome very much included. For centuries, Kushite queens ruled not merely as royal wives or regents holding power temporarily for absent kings, but as sovereigns in their own right, with a formal title, Kandake, sometimes rendered Candace, that Roman writers eventually mistook for a personal name, rather than the royal office it actually was. Multiple Kandakes appear in the archaeological and textual record commanding armies, commissioning monumental building projects, and appearing on temple reliefs performing rituals reserved elsewhere for kings alone. This wasn't a one-time anomaly. It was a durable institutional feature of Kushite kingship, stretching across generations, which mattered enormously, because it meant that when Rome eventually pushed south to test Kush's borders, the ruler who met them wasn't a king. It was a queen who had inherited a genuine tradition of female military and political command, not a woman thrust unexpectedly into a man's role. Trouble started in 27 BC when Cornelius Gallus, the newly installed Roman prefect of Egypt, attempted to impose Roman taxation on Lower Nubia, territory Kush considered squarely within its own sphere of control. Kushite forces responded immediately and decisively, striking north into Roman-held Egyptian territory and seizing the border towns of Syene, modern Aswan, and the sacred island temple complex of Philae, reportedly enslaving the local population and, in a calculated insult, toppling bronze statues of the new Roman emperor Augustus himself. This was not a desperate raid by a weaker power. It was a targeted, confident military operation against the newest, most aggressively expanding empire in the ancient Mediterranean world, proof that whoever was making decisions in Meroë had assessed Rome's early position in Egypt and judged it vulnerable enough to strike. That ruler was Kandake Amanirenas. Ancient sources describe her losing an eye at some point during the conflict that followed. The Roman prefect Petronius, according to Greek geographer Strabo, would later refer to her dismissively as the one-eyed queen. What Roman condescension failed to register was that this one-eyed queen was about to become one of the very few rulers on Rome's entire imperial frontier to fight Augustus's empire to a negotiated draw rather than outright conquest. Amanirenas' husband, King Pteritechus, died early in the conflict, and command increasingly fell to Amanirenas herself, alongside her son, Prince Akinidad, who was likely killed in action as the war ground on. This was a family and a monarchy that paid for this war in direct personal loss at the highest level and kept fighting regardless. Rome's response, when it came, was formidable. Petronius assembled a Roman force of roughly 10,000 infantry and 800 cavalry and marched south into Kushite territory, ultimately pushing all the way to Napata itself, the old Kushite religious heartland, and sacking it around 23 BC, even as Amanirenas commanded a considerably larger Kushite force, reportedly numbering some 30,000. On paper, the raw numbers favor Kush enormously. In practice, Roman military organization, logistics, and equipment gave Petronius's smaller, more disciplined force a real advantage in direct engagements, a pattern that had already devastated less prepared opponents across the entire Mediterranean world. Napata burning should have been the moment this war ended in a decisive Roman victory. The same way most confrontations with Rome's expanding empire ended for everyone else on its borders. It wasn't. Somewhere in the fighting that followed the sack of Napata, Kushite forces struck back at a Roman garrison and came away with an extraordinary prize, a bronze head cut from a full statue of the Emperor Augustus himself that had presumably been erected somewhere in the contested territory as a marker of Roman authority. Rather than melt it down or discard it, the Kushites carried Augustus's severed bronze head hundreds of miles south to Meroë and buried it, deliberately, ceremonially, beneath the entrance steps of a temple dedicated to Kushite victory. For centuries afterward, every priest, worshipper, and dignitary who climbed those steps to enter the temple walked directly over the face of the man who ruled the most powerful empire the Mediterranean world had ever seen. In 1910, archaeologists excavating that temple floor found the head exactly where it had been left, and it now sits in the British Museum, one of the most quietly defiant artifacts to survive from the entire ancient world. The war ground on for roughly 3 more years, neither side able to force a final, decisive result. Eventually, Kushite envoys traveled to negotiate directly with Augustus, and the peace settlement that followed, around 21 to 20 BC, was strikingly unlike almost every other treaty Rome imposed on a neighboring power during this period of aggressive imperial expansion. Kush paid no tribute. Kush ceded no significant territory. Kush was not annexed, garrisoned, or reduced to a client state answering to a Roman governor. The border was essentially restored to where it had stood before the fighting began, with Rome quietly withdrawing its ambitions of pushing its African frontier any further south. For a Kandake who had lost her husband, her son, and her sacred capital in the course of this war, walking away with Kush's full sovereignty intact wasn't a footnote. It was, functionally, a victory. One of remarkably few any power achieved against Augustus's Rome by force of arms rather than diplomacy alone. With its southern border secured against Rome for good, Kush entered centuries of continued prosperity centered on Meroë. And nowhere is that prosperity more visible today than in its funerary architecture. Kushite royalty built pyramids for their dead across multiple burial sites near Meroë, continuing a tradition borrowed originally from Egyptian royal practice, but developed with a distinctly Kushite style, smaller, steeper-sided, and far more numerous than their Egyptian counterparts. Altogether, more than 200 Kushite pyramids survive in the deserts of modern Sudan, considerably more than the total number of pyramids in all of Egypt combined. Most visitors to Egypt's Giza Plateau have no idea that fact is even true. Kush wasn't imitating Egypt's most iconic architectural achievement in some diminished, second-hand way. In sheer quantity, it outbuilt it. Kush's cultural independence from Egypt shows up just as clearly in writing as it does in architecture. Sometime around the 2nd century BC, the Kushites developed their own script, Meroitic, adapted partly from Egyptian hieroglyphic and cursive forms, but representing an entirely different, unrelated language. The everyday spoken language of the Meroitic kingdom itself, finally given its own written form after centuries of relying on Egyptian for royal inscriptions. Here's the strange part. In the early 20th century, the British Egyptologist Francis Llewellyn Griffith successfully worked out the Meroitic alphabet. Every single letter, every phonetic sound. We can, quite literally, sound out any Meroitic inscription today, letter by letter, exactly as a Kushite scribe would have pronounced it 2,000 years ago. And we still don't know, for the overwhelming majority of surviving texts, what most of those words actually mean. Without a bilingual text, a Meroitic Rosetta Stone, linking Meroitic vocabulary to a language we already understand, we're left able to read the sounds of an entire civilization's language while remaining largely locked out of its meaning. Somewhere in modern Sudan, stone inscriptions are still, quite literally, speaking a language nobody alive can fully understand. No single catastrophic military defeat ended Kush the way Rome's legions ended so many other ancient states. Instead, the kingdom entered a long, gradual decline over the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, driven by a combination of pressures that historians are still piecing together from incomplete evidence. Centuries of intensive agriculture and, quite plausibly, the enormous fuel demands of Meroë's iron industry, smelting operations that consumed huge quantities of wood for charcoal, appear to have degraded the surrounding land, pushing the region toward desertification. At the same time, the trade routes that had made Kush wealthy for centuries were shifting. A rising power to the southeast, the Kingdom of Aksum in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, was increasingly capturing the Red Sea trade that had once flowed more heavily through Kushite hands along the Nile. Wealth and traffic were quietly draining away from Meroë toward a rival that hadn't even existed as a major power when Kush first humbled a Roman army. The end, when it came, arrived from that same rising rival. Around 330 AD, King Ezana of Aksum, recently converted to Christianity and expanding his own kingdom's reach, led a military campaign into Kushite territory and, according to a victory inscription he left behind, dealt a severe blow to what remained of Meroitic power, possibly sacking the city of Meroë itself. By this point, Kush was already a fraction of the power it had been at its height, weakened by generations of environmental strain and economic decline rather than sudden collapse. Ezana's campaign didn't destroy a thriving empire in a single stroke. It delivered a final, well-documented blow to a kingdom that had already been fading for 100 years, closing out a Nile Valley civilization that had, by that point, outlasted what the western half of the Roman Empire was itself about to enter. Its own final century. Given everything Kush accomplished, conquering and ruling Egypt for a century, outbuilding Egypt's own pyramid count, developing an independent writing system, fighting Rome to a negotiated peace few other powers ever achieved, the obvious question is why so few people outside specialist archaeology have ever heard of it. Part of the answer is simply colonial-era historiography. 19th and early 20th century European scholarship, steeped in racial assumptions about African civilization, frequently treated Kush's achievements as derivative imitations of Egypt rather than as the product of an independent, sophisticated state in its own right. Even when, as with the pyramid count, the evidence pointed toward Kush having outdone Egypt rather than merely copied it. Part of the answer is more mundane. Sudan's Meroitic sites remain far less excavated, far less funded, and far less integrated into global tourism infrastructure than Egypt's, meaning fewer people ever encounter them directly, in person, or through popular media. And part of the answer is that undeciphered Meroitic language itself has kept Kush from telling its own story in its own words the way Egyptian hieroglyphs, once decoded, allowed Egypt to do so vividly. The kingdom didn't disappear from history because it was minor. It disappeared from popular memory because of who got to write the history afterward, and what tools they had or didn't have to actually read what Kush itself had left behind. Strip away everything else, and here's what's left. An African kingdom that ruled Egypt as legitimate pharaohs for a century, retreated and rebuilt after catastrophic defeat, not once, but repeatedly, developed an industrial-scale iron economy centuries before comparable operations existed almost anywhere else on the continent, was ruled for generations by warrior queens with real institutional power, fought the newly formed Roman Empire to a standstill when Augustus himself was at the height of his authority, and left behind more pyramids than the country most associated with that word in the first place. None of that required Egypt's permission, Rome's approval, or a place in the version of ancient history most of us grew up learning. Kush simply built its own civilization on its own terms for roughly 1,000 years, and the fact that so few people know its name today says less about what Kush actually achieved than it does about whose achievements get remembered and whose get quietly left in the sand. If ancient history that never made it into your textbooks is what keeps you watching, subscribe. There's an entire ancient world still waiting to be properly told. And tell us in the comments. Which forgotten civilization should we cover next?